Sir, this is a restricted area. The voice cut through the desert heat like a blade through silk, sharp, professional, and utterly unyielding. I'm going to need you to move to the public viewing section. James Callahan, 87 years old, with the Nevada sun beating down on shoulders that had carried more weight than most men could imagine, remained motionless. He wasn't looking at the young Air Force captain who'd addressed him. His weathered gaze was fixed on the 6 F-16 Fighting Falcons arranged in perfect formation on the tarmac, the Thunderbirds. Their red, white, and blue paint schemes gleamed under the afternoon light, and in that shimmer of heat rising from the concrete, James could smell something beyond jet fuel and hot asphalt. He could smell history. His history. The captain moved closer, her shadow falling across him. "Sir, did you hear me?" James turned slowly. She was perhaps in her late 20s, every inch of her bearing screaming academy graduate. Her uniform could have been used as a measuring standard for military precision. Golden hair swept back without a single strand out of place. The name embroidered on her chest read, Hayes. In her eyes, James recognized something he'd seen 1,000 times before, the unwavering confidence of youth that mistakes a rulebook for wisdom. "I heard you, Captain," James replied, his voice carrying the rough edges of age but remaining steady. "I was admiring the aircraft." "You can admire them from the designated spectator zone," Captain Hayes responded, gesturing toward a cordoned area perhaps 100 yards distant. A modest crowd had gathered there, families waving small flags, retired officers in their veterans' caps, and aviation enthusiasts with expensive cameras. "This section is reserved for authorized guests and credentialed personnel only." "I have an invitation," James said simply, reaching toward his windbreaker pocket with fingers that had once been quick enough to pull a screaming aircraft out of a death spiral. Hayes exhaled through her nose, not quite a sigh, but close. "Sir, with all due respect, everyone claims to have an invitation." Standing beside her was a younger lieutenant, fresh-faced and uncomfortable, who kept glancing between his superior officer and the elderly man, as if watching two trains approaching the same intersection. "Unless you're carrying current military identification or a specifically issued access credential for this demonstration," Hayes continued, her tone acquiring the weariness of someone who'd had this conversation before, "I cannot permit you to remain in this area." The surrounding crowd had begun to notice. Conversations died mid-sentence, heads turned, phones slowly lifted. No matter how small, a confrontation always drew spectators. James felt the attention like physical pressure against his back. He hadn't come here to be watched. He'd come to pay respects to the sky he'd once owned. Hayes stood with her weight evenly distributed, hands locked behind her back in a textbook parade rest position. Everything about her posture communicated immovable authority. She was the guardian of this gate, the enforcer of regulations that existed for good reasons she'd never had to test. Looking at James, she didn't see a guest. She saw a problem waiting to happen, an elderly gentleman who'd gotten confused about where civilians were supposed to be, a potential security incident. "I'm afraid my current identification expired some years ago," James admitted, producing a carefully folded letter from his jacket. It bore the seal of the Secretary of the Air Force. But this should suffice. Hayes accepted the document with the brisk efficiency of someone performing a tedious but necessary task. Her eyes moved across the page without really absorbing the words. She was scanning for specific indicators she could dismiss. "Sir, this appears to be a standard acknowledgement of veteran status. We deeply appreciate your service to our country. However, that doesn't constitute authorization to access restricted areas during an active air show." She returned the letter as if it might contaminate her gloves. The lieutenant shifted his weight. "Captain, perhaps we should verify with the event, Lieutenant Chen." Hayes didn't raise her voice, but the temperature dropped 20 degrees. "I am the designated security officer for this sector. I bear responsibility for every person within this perimeter. I will not waste command resources because an elderly veteran is unclear about proper procedures." She redirected her attention to James, and her voice acquired an edge sharp enough to draw blood. "Sir, this is your final opportunity to comply voluntarily. Please proceed to the public viewing area, or I will have no choice but to request security personnel to escort you from the facility." The humiliation wasn't loud. It crept in through the cracks between her words, the exhausted patience, the absolute certainty of his irrelevance, the unspoken dismissal of everything he represented. He'd become an inconvenience to be cleared away before the important attendees arrived. James heard the murmurs spreading through the crowd, saw more phones rising to capture his quiet disgrace for social media posterity. Then, Hayes noticed the patch on his leather jacket. It was positioned over his heart, small, severely faded, barely distinguishable from the worn brown leather. A black shape that might once have been an aircraft, wings that could have been shadows. The edges had frayed so badly that threads hung loose like spider silk. "And what exactly is this supposed to represent?" she asked, and now there was amusement dancing at the corners of her mouth, her gloved finger pressed against the patch. "Did you pick this up at a flea market? Some kind of vintage military collectible?" That touch, that question, that careless mockery. Something ancient stirred inside James Callahan. Reality fractured. The scorching Nevada afternoon shattered like glass. Suddenly, he wasn't standing on concrete beneath a merciless sun. He was freezing, his breath crystallizing in an unpressurized cockpit. The F-16 vanished, replaced by the cramped interior of an A-1 Skyraider, every instrument glowing a sickly phosphorescent green. Below him, the jungle of Laos stretched into infinity, silver black under a sliver of moon. His hands, young again, steady with the certainty of countless hours, gripped a control stick that hummed with the raw power of a piston engine that officially didn't exist. "Ghost lid, we're picking up ground fire." The voice in his headset belonged to someone barely old enough to vote, terrified, but holding together. "Roger, Ghost 2, maintain radio silence, drop to treetop level." His own voice, decades younger, absolute. The darkness erupted in angry orange flowers. Anti-aircraft fire transformed the sky into a galaxy of death. Tracers carved neon paths through the black, close enough that he could feel their heat bleeding through the canopy. His aircraft shuddered as shrapnel found metal. Somewhere behind him, someone was screaming into a dead radio. The vision collapsed. James blinked, and he was back. Nevada. 2025, standing before a captain who had no comprehension of what she was touching. He looked at her, not with anger, but with something far more devastating. Pity. While Hayes prepared to signal for security personnel, someone else had been watching with growing concern. Master Sergeant Dale Reeves had spent 32 years in the Air Force. He'd seen enough to know when something was deeply wrong. He couldn't identify that patch. He couldn't place the old man's face, but he recognized something in how the veteran stood, the way someone carries themselves when they have been tested by fire and emerged forged rather than broken. Reeves turned away from the confrontation, pulling his phone free. He didn't call base security. He called the wing commander's personal aide. "Lieutenant, it's Reeves," he said quietly, urgently. "You need to get General Bowman, now. We have a situation developing at the VIP checkpoint. Captain Hayes is about to detain a civilian, an elderly man wearing a flight jacket with an old patch I've never seen before. I can't explain it, sir, but you need to get the general here immediately." Reeves couldn't explain his certainty, but 3 decades of service had given him instincts that screamed when something mattered. This mattered. On the observation deck overlooking the airfield, Major General Christine Bowman was conducting final preparations for the demonstration. She'd commanded wings, led combat operations, and earned her stars through a combination of brilliance and relentless dedication. When her aide approached with careful urgency, she initially waved him off. "General, Master Sergeant Reeves called from the security checkpoint. Handle it through the duty officer." "Ma'am, he insisted I reach you personally." The aide's voice dropped to near whisper. Something about Captain Hayes detaining a civilian, an elderly veteran wearing an old flight jacket with an unidentified patch. Bowman's expression shifted. Her eyes narrowed. "Describe the patch." The aide consulted his phone. Black silhouette, possibly wings, some kind of aircraft shape, very faded, very old. The general went absolutely still. When she spoke, her voice carried a knife's edge. "Get me classified archive access, search parameters, Vietnam War, covert air operations, Laos." Her aide's fingers flew across a secure tablet. Moments later, an image materialized, A scanned document from 1965, marked with classification stamps that should have kept it buried forever. A design sketch, black wings, a ghost-like aircraft. Beneath it, barely legible, Operation Silent Wings. General Bowman's face lost all color. She looked up at her staff with an expression that made colonels flinch. "Get my vehicle. Get the wing commander. Get the base historian. We're going to that checkpoint. Move now." Nobody asked questions. They simply obeyed with the speed of people who just watched their world tilt sideways. Back at the checkpoint, Captain Hayes had reached the end of her patience. She remained completely unaware of the firestorm she'd ignited. All she could see was an obstinate elderly man making her look incompetent in front of hundreds of witnesses. "I've given you every reasonable opportunity to cooperate," she announced, her voice carrying across the suddenly quiet tarmac. "You are disrupting a military event and refusing to comply with lawful security directives. I am placing you in temporary custody, pending verification of your identity by base security." She reached for James's arm. "Please turn around and place your hands behind your back." This was the moment of no return. James made no move to resist or pull away. He simply met her eyes, and what she saw there stopped her for just a heartbeat. Not defiance, not anger, just a profound sadness that seemed to have accumulated over decades. Then a voice crashed across the tarmac like thunder. "Captain Hayes, stand down immediately!" Hayes froze with her hand still extended. Every person present stopped breathing. The crowd pivoted as a single organism. Approaching at a march that could have been choreographed for its precision and fury was Major General Bowman, accompanied by the wing commander, the base historian, and a formation of senior officers that represented enough rank to command an entire war. They moved with unified purpose, their collective authority so tangible it seemed to bend the air around them. The sharp report of their boots against concrete was the only sound in the world. Hayes's face drained of blood. She snapped to attention with such force it should have been audible, her body rigid with shock and dawning horror. General Bowman's attention never wavered from James Callahan. She covered the remaining distance in seconds, stopping exactly 1 arm's length from the elderly man in the worn leather jacket with the mysterious patch. For several heartbeats, she simply looked at him. Awe and profound respect transformed her features. Then, with a motion of such precision it could have been measured with instruments, she brought her hand up in a salute that carried the weight of her entire career. "Mr. Callahan." Her voice resonated across the silent airfield, thick with emotion, but steady as stone. "It is a privilege, sir." Without needing any signal, every officer in her entourage, the wing commander, the historian, the entire assembled staff, rendered their own salutes in perfect unison. A wave of respect washing over a single elderly man in a faded jacket. The crowd's collective gasp was audible even over the distant whine of jet engines. Phones that moments before had been recording an old man's humiliation now captured something extraordinary. Captain Hayes stood frozen, her mind unable to process the impossible scene unfolding. This couldn't be real. General Bowman lowered her salute but maintained her position of respect. She turned slightly, addressing not just James but every person within earshot. "For those who don't understand what you're witnessing," her voice carried with the clarity of a trumpet call, "allow me to provide context. This gentleman is James Ghost Lead Callahan. That patch he wears," she gestured toward it with something approaching reverence, "is not a collectible. It represents a squadron that exists in no official records. A unit that flew in a war we officially never fought. They called themselves the Silent Wings." She paused, letting comprehension sink in. Between 1965 and 1972, North Vietnamese forces used Cambodia and Laos as supply corridors and staging areas, believing themselves safe because American forces were legally prohibited from operating there. So the Air Force created a solution that couldn't officially exist. A small group of volunteer pilots, the best we had, flew missions that generated no paperwork, no records, no recognition. The general's gaze returned to James with something approaching reverence. They flew A-1 Sky Raiders, propeller-driven attack aircraft specifically chosen because they could operate low and slow beneath enemy radar systems. Every identifying mark was removed. No insignia, no tail numbers, no radio transponders. If they were captured, we would disavow all knowledge of their existence. Her voice grew stronger, carrying across the assembled crowd. For 7 years, these pilots flew missions so dangerous that each one should have been impossible. They navigated through mountain passes in weather that grounded everyone else. They provided close air support for operations that never officially happened. They rescued downed air crews from locations we weren't supposed to reach. Mr. Callahan personally flew 183 combat missions. He was shot down twice and evaded capture both times. He saved 14 American lives by landing in hot zones under direct enemy fire to extract downed pilots. The silence was now absolute, broken only by the desert wind. The men of Silent Wings had their identities sealed. Their families were told they were on routine training assignments. Some never returned home. Their names appear on no memorials. Their sacrifices were classified to protect operations that saved thousands of American lives, but couldn't be acknowledged without creating an international incident. Finally, General Bowman turned toward Captain Hayes. The temperature seemed to drop 40 degrees. When she spoke, her voice was surgical in its precision. "You stand on an airfield where pilots like Mr. Callahan learned their craft," she said, each word carefully weighted. "You wear a uniform that exists because people like him were willing to fly missions so dangerous they couldn't even be acknowledged. And when a living piece of that history stood before you, you saw only a problem that needed to be removed." She took one step closer to Hayes. "Your duty, Captain, is to protect this base and the people on it. But wisdom requires understanding that security doesn't only mean checking credentials. It means recognizing that some people carry credentials that were classified before you were born. You saw an elderly man in a worn jacket. You should have seen the foundation upon which your entire career is built." Her voice softened slightly, but lost none of its steel. "Report to my office at 0800 tomorrow. We will have an extensive conversation about what it means to serve in this uniform." General Bowman turned back to James, and her expression transformed into something approaching anguish. "Mr. Callahan, on behalf of every member of the United States Air Force, I apologize profoundly for the disrespect shown to you today." James raised one weathered hand, gently stopping her words. His eyes sought out Captain Hayes, young, trembling, her world collapsing around her. "General," he said, his voice quiet but carrying clearly, "I've learned something about uniforms in my time. They change style. The aircraft get faster, the technology more sophisticated. But the fundamental challenge never changes, knowing when rules serve their purpose and when wisdom requires something more." He paused. This captain was enforcing security protocols. Perhaps with more enthusiasm than judgment, but her intent was correct. The lessons that matter most are usually the ones that hurt. "I know. I've learned quite a few of them." As he spoke those words of grace, one final memory surfaced with crystal clarity. Laos, 1969. After midnight, his Sky Raider was dying. He could feel it in the controls, sluggish responses, the sickening vibration of damage he couldn't assess. Below him, somewhere in that lightless jungle, an F-4 crew was surrounded, their ejection beacons painting them as targets. Every rational calculation said he should abort. His fuel was critical. His aircraft was compromised. The odds were impossible. But 2 Americans were down there, and if he left, they died. He pushed the stick forward, diving through a hell of anti-aircraft fire. His guns hammered. Rockets streaked into the darkness. The aircraft shuddered with each hit it absorbed. Metal punching through metal, but kept flying. Always kept flying. He watched through his scope as the rescue helicopter extracted the crew. Watched them lifted to safety, mission complete. As he limped back toward Thailand, nursing his damaged aircraft through the darkness, he'd looked at the patch velcroed to his flight suit. The ghost, the silent wings, a reminder of what they were. Invisible, unacknowledged, essential. The memory faded. Nevada. Present. General Bowman gestured toward the VIP area. "Mr. Callahan, your seat has been reserved. The Thunderbirds are prepared to meet you before the demonstration." James nodded, a slight smile touching his lips. I'd be honored. As he walked past Captain Hayes, he paused. She couldn't meet his eyes. Captain, he said gently. Her head came up. What happened here today? Learn from it. Not everyone who seems out of place is. Sometimes history walks up to you wearing a worn-out jacket. Your job is to be wise enough to recognize it when it does. She managed a nod, unable to form words. James continued toward the VIP section, escorted by the general and her staff. The crowd erupted, not polite appreciation, but a standing ovation that built and built until it shook the air itself. The weeks that followed became legend. Captain Rebecca Hayes was not discharged or formally punished. Instead, General Bowman assigned her to create and lead an Air Force-wide program on military heritage and veteran recognition. It was named, with quiet irony, the Heritage Initiative. Punishment, yes, but also an opportunity for redemption through education. One gray Tuesday, James Callahan sat in his customary corner of the VFW hall, a mug of coffee growing cold between his hands. The building was quiet. Oak wood that had absorbed decades of stories, the faint scent of yesterday's coffee and old memories. The front door opened with its familiar groan. Rebecca Hayes stood framed in the doorway, dressed in civilian clothes that made her look half her age, vulnerable in ways her uniform never allowed. She saw him and hesitated, then approached his table carrying a thick hardcover book, Shadow Warriors, Classified Air Operations in Southeast Asia. Mr. Callahan, she managed, her voice barely functional. James looked up with a welcoming smile that erased years from his weathered face. Captain, please, call me Jim. She clutched the book like a shield. I was hoping you might sign this for me. I'd be happy to, he replied, indicating the empty chair across from him. But only if you'll sit down and share some coffee. She sat carefully, as if the chair might break. He accepted the book and the pen she offered. Instead of signing the title page, he opened to the chapter on covert operations in Laos. In the margin, he wrote in careful script, for Rebecca. The aircraft change, the missions change, but courage remains constant. Jim Callahan quote. He slid the book back across the table. She read his words and tears tracked down her face. I need to apologize again, she whispered. James waved the words away. You already have. Now you're learning. That's what matters. He leaned forward slightly. Let me tell you about a pilot named Danny Kowalski. Best wingman I ever flew with. He grew up in Pennsylvania, worked in his father's hardware store, and was absolutely terrified of night flying. As rain began to patter against the windows, the old ghost and the humbled young officer sat together across a scarred table, no longer adversaries but two people connected by the institution they'd both sworn to serve. One teaching, one finally ready to listen to lessons that couldn't be found in any manual. The end. The story of James Ghost Lead Callahan reminds us that heroes walk among us, their courage often hidden beneath ordinary exteriors. If this story moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe to Hidden Story for more tales that honor our heroes.